He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, I'm William Ray. Welcome to Black Sheep. We're sitting in Holloway Road, a winding cul-de-sac in Wellington at the far end of Aro Valley. It's about 8:30 p.m, 1974, and this spot is about to become the site of one of New Zealand's most controversial Cold War spy stories. Dark clouds had gathered overhead and a few drops of rain were falling. The street would have seemed quiet, but in fact it was the centre of intense, silent scrutiny. That afternoon, a contingent of some 25 detectives from all over the Wellington region had been brought together for a briefing by the SIS, New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, the agency responsible for detecting and countering spies and nefarious foreign interference. Later that evening, police were told, the senior KGB officer at New Zealand's Russian embassy, Dmitry Razgovorov, was planning a meeting with one of his agents in Holloway Road. The identity of the suspected agent had only been discovered a few months earlier, and it had sent shockwaves through senior levels of government. Dr Bill Sutch. Dr Sutch was one of New Zealand's top economists. He'd been a senior civil servant, an advisor to prime ministers. He'd represented New Zealand at the United Nations. His books on economics and history had sold tens of thousands of copies. But over the past few months, the SIS had spotted Dr Sutch in covert meetings with Dmitry Razgovorov. Now they planned to catch him in the act. Police and SIS officers took up positions, hiding in cars, behind bushes. 3 men were crammed together in the cubicle of a public toilet. A tense voice crackled over the radio. Razgovorov was on his way. Men with binoculars tracked his big Mercedes up Ardle Street towards Holloway Road. Another voice on the radio. Dr Sutch had been spotted. He was 800 metres away, walking quickly up the southern edge of Ardle Street. Razgovorov got out of his car and cut through a small park towards Holloway Road. Then, just as the two were about to meet, the clouds broke. Nobody could see or hear anything through the sudden pounding rain. There was a pause. A few confused, tense minutes. Then, in an instant, men were running and yelling. There were flashes of light. At first you might have mistaken them for lightning, but actually it was a camera flash, catching what would become a famous image of Dmitry Razgovorov sprinting down Holloway Road. Officers descended on Bill Sutch, who was equal parts shocked and drenched. Minutes later, the chaos was over. Dr Sutch was whisked away by the police. Presuming you're listening to this podcast the day it came out, Bill Sutch's arrest happened exactly 50 years ago today, September 27th, 1974. And it's still controversial. The question of exactly what Bill Sutch was doing in Holloway Road all those years ago hasn't been fully answered, and possibly it never will be. But given it's the 50th anniversary of the so-called Sutch affair, we felt it was worth taking a bit of time to revisit New Zealand's most mysterious Cold War spy story. Bill Sutch, or William Ball Sutch to give his full name, was born in Lancashire in England. He was just 8 months old when his family came to New Zealand. He was a small, sickly child, and the captain only agreed to take him on the condition he be given milk every day. Bill was the third of 5 kids. His dad Ted was a carpenter and his mother Ellen was a dressmaker. The Sutch family weren't the poorest of the poor, but life wasn't always easy.
The family was working class. In those days, being a builder, as his father was pretty volatile. He'd get work, he'd get not. Bill once said that he used to watch his father walking up the hill to the house, and if he had his toolkit, he didn't have a job.
This is economist and historian Brian Easton. Brian wrote Bill Sutch's entry in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography. He's also written several papers on him. I'll include links in the description. The Sutch family landed in Wellington in 1908. Bill would later write a lot about his family background, how when his dad was injured and out of work, his mum stepped up to support the family with her sewing. He would later describe the struggle of his parents and of New Zealanders all over the country as a quest for security. It became the title of one of his best-selling books. Bill's older brother followed his father into trade as a builder, and Bill would probably have done the same if not for his headmaster.
Bill was at primary school. His headmaster pleaded that he should go on to secondary school. He was so bright. And as a result, he went on to secondary school, then Teachers College and university.
After 2 years working as a teacher, Bill Sutch set sail for New York. He got a PhD in economics at Columbia University. Then, study complete, he followed the great Kiwi tradition of going on his big OE.
He did the full circuit. From America, he went to Europe, through Russia, India, and then Australia and back again.
And he makes a point that in this time he sort of makes an effort to see how those, working class or people in sometimes very extreme poverty are living. That's sort of his interest.
He talks about seeing people lying out in the street in America and in Europe, homeless, hungry.
By the time Bill Sutch arrived back in New Zealand, the Great Depression was in full swing. There were plenty of people homeless and hungry here as well.
It was very tough. He talks about getting back from overseas and a schoolmate seeing him, and they took him home for a meal, and just for special, they gave him butter.
Most of Bill's friends and family were in poverty, labouring on work relief programs for low wages, often far from home. Bill himself was on work relief for a while. So now we're in the 1930s and Bill Sutch is in his mid-20s. The Great Depression has been a catastrophe, but Bill Sutch still had a lot going for him. He was smart, he was charismatic, he was also very handsome, I've got to say. Look up an old picture if you don't believe me. He has this cool moustache and this sort of self-confident, sexy smirk on his face. My executive producer says he looks like Errol Flynn. I was too young to get that reference, but I looked it up on Wikipedia, and yep, the resemblance is uncanny. Anyway, that self-confidence sometimes got Bill into trouble. In fact, a couple of years after arriving back home in New Zealand, it nearly cost him his life. Bill Sutch was a keen tramper, but in April 1933, he and 3 of his friends ran into major trouble crossing the Tararua Ranges. They got lost among gorges, steep cliffs and swollen streams. Some of the party were injured and the weather took a turn for the worse. A massive search and rescue effort was launched, the largest New Zealand had ever seen, something like 200 volunteers, aircraft, radios, the whole thing. It actually prompted the foundation of New Zealand Land Search and Rescue the following year. Bill Sutch and his friends walked out of the bush 15 days later to the intense relief of the searchers, but that relief soured a bit when Bill claimed his group didn't really need rescuing.
He said they were never lost, they always exactly knew where they were. And there was a lot of anger because they put a lot of effort into it.
But that anger wasn't enough to stop Bill Sutch getting his first job in government. Thanks to his advanced degree in economics, he was picked as an advisor to the finance minister, Gordon Coates.
Coates said, "Oh, you're almost as disliked by the public as I am." So he joined what was known as the think tank. It was a very unusual organisation. In those days, the Treasury, as we know it today, hardly existed. It was an accounting department. And Coates had, I think, all 3 PhDs in economics in New Zealand working for him.
And what was the advice that he was giving? Because this is like critical times, the Depression is still going on.
We don't know much. I've not seen records of what he was doing in the 30s. I suspect very much a small treasury, and he gave advice on everything.
A few months after taking this job, in January 1934, Bill Sutch married Morva Williams. Morva was one of the friends who'd been with Bill on that disastrous tramping expedition back in 1933. She and Bill were both interested in art and culture and left-wing politics. Bill was active in all sorts of groups, the Institute of International Affairs, the Left Book Club, the Progressive Publishing Society, the Wellington Cooperative Book Society, the Fabian Society. There's a whole lot more on this list. Bill also covertly published some of his own writings under pseudonyms. His government job meant he couldn't always express his more radical ideas under his real name. Bill Sutch was a socialist. He would later describe the Labour Party as a conservative party. He also helped, sort of surreptitiously, to publish an article which was very critical of the first Labour Party Prime Minister, Michael Joseph Savage. That did not win him a lot of friends in the Labour Party. Now, that all seems significant given the accusations of Bill Sutch spying for the Soviets later on. But back in the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, being a socialist wasn't exactly unusual, and it was a very broad term. It could refer to supporting revolutionaries like Lenin or Stalin, or much more moderate figures like George Bernard Shaw. In an interview with Catherine Ryan on RNZ's 9 to Noon programme in 2008, Bill Sutch's daughter, Helen Sutch, described her father's beliefs like this.
My father was actually very much an economic patriot. He believed that the economy was there to serve the interests of people, and that's why he believed in full employment. He believed in access for all to education and health services, and it was a very personal thing for him. He'd lived through the Depression. His family had been terribly poor when his father was disabled in a work accident, and his mother kept the family going, 5 children, by sewing, and this was in the years before there was any social security of any kind. So he was very aware of what poverty and insecurity meant for ordinary people.
Helen says her father's socialism was less influenced by Marx or Lenin and more by Christian Methodism, although he always had a soft spot for Soviet Russia.
He admired the Soviet Union for what he perceived as its economic success, at least in those days. Of course, again, with the benefit of hindsight, we think they were an economic disaster, but he saw that they were trying to give universal access to health and education services for the population. They were trying to employ everybody. They had turned themselves into an industrial power from a sort of basically a feudal power, feudal situation. So he, in a sense, saw it as a story of economic transformation, and that was, the aspect that interested him.
Brian Easton tried to prove that Bill Sutch was actually some kind of secret Marxist, but he was never able to find any evidence. He put it like this in one of the articles he wrote about Sutch.
Seeing the Soviet Union as a bulwark against the worst of capitalism or American imperialism does not make one a Marxist. It's very unlikely that Sutch was ever a member of the Communist Party. His wife tells of attempting to get him to join her in the party in 1939. Sutch forcefully explained that he had never belonged to any party, that he would never be told by anyone what to think. He would never follow any party line.
Speaking of parties, the 1935 election brought the Labour Party to power for the first time in New Zealand. Bill Sutch went from advising Gordon Coates to advising Walter Nash, his Labour Party replacement. Labour brought in all kinds of economic and social reforms, but again, we don't have much information of exactly how Bill Sutch was involved. The sources we do have suggest that Walter Nash and other senior Labour politicians saw Sutch as a passionate and intelligent civil servant, but also a bit of a loose cannon. Like, in 1940, Bill Sutch was asked to write a social history of New Zealand as part of the centenary celebrations for the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But the writing that Sutch produced was a lot less celebratory about New Zealand's past than his political masters probably hoped for. It was rejected for publication, and Bill was quietly advised to lock the manuscript in the back of a cabinet and leave it there for a long time. Instead, he published it. That 1940 manuscript was turned into two of Bill Sutch's most famous books, Poverty and Progress in New Zealand in 1941 and The Quest for Security in New Zealand in 1942. Poverty and Progress would eventually sell more than 100,000 copies. A lot of people were interested in Sutch, and among those people was an extraordinary woman named Shirley Smith. Could you tell me a little bit about Shirley Smith to start? I mean, who was she? Where did she come from? She had quite a different background to William Sutch.
Yes, very different. William, it's a huge big question.
It's a huge big question. I mean sort of her background. This is Sarah Gaetanos. She's a historian and author of Shirley Smith, A Life Examined. And there's a lot to examine. Shirley Smith was a trailblazing lawyer, human rights campaigner, first woman to lecture in law at Victoria University, and at the time she met Bill Sutch, she was a communist. In fact, Smith had been a communist ever since she was a teenager at Ngātawa boarding school outside Wellington.
She had to take part in a debate that they had, mock debates, and her role had to be for the Communist Party. So the research she did convinced her, and she was a complete believer for a long time.
Shirley Smith met Bill Sutch after hearing a lecture he gave in early 1940. Shirley was highly educated, interested in cultural and social issues. She and Bill moved in the same circles. Over the next few years, he and Morva had her around for dinner parties. The two hit it off, intellectually and romantically. They began an affair. Sarah Gaetanos says Shirley and Bill's daughter, Helen Sutch, thought her mother fell head over heels for Bill.
I asked Helen what was the happiest time of their marriage, and she said before they married. I think the sort of secrecy with which they had to conduct their affair probably added a certain element to it too. But no, she did fall in love with him. That's no question about that. And she had other men who were interested in her, who wanted to marry her.
But Shirley wanted Bill. And Bill, as it turned out, wanted Shirley. In February 1944, he divorced Morva, and later that year, he and Shirley were married. But while Bill and Shirley's relationship started off with a bit of whirlwind romance, it soon ran into challenges. For one thing, Sarah Gaetanos says Bill Sutch had affairs all through his life, before and after meeting Shirley. There was another problem. Bill Sutch was a self-described feminist. He wrote and spoke publicly about the need for women's equality, often very passionately, and he supported Shirley's career as a lawyer. But he still expected Shirley to fulfil all the traditional roles of a wife, cooking, cleaning, looking after the house, and he just couldn't be convinced otherwise.
I mean, that was what was so difficult for Shirley when she suddenly was told, you have to iron my shirts and you do this, and he wasn't going to do his share. I mean, the fact that it is mentioned that he polished the shoes or did the odd thing shows you how little he did. The marriage had high points and very low points, and there would have been times when she was deeply, deeply unhappy, or when they would just had very separate lives and she got on and did her own thing. But when he was in trouble, she was right back there at his side, stand by my man.
Sarah says Shirley compared Bill to a classical Greek hero. He was gifted with natural intelligence and a drive to do great things, but he was cursed with a fatal flaw: arrogance.
She came from a very different background, but she really did understand his background. She had this great compassion and an understanding of this is why you are the way you are. So it humanized him, and he can't, it's very easy to see him and the whole thing in black and white, just to be totally critical of him. But she just saw a much more complex individual. I mean, he had a terrible childhood in many respects, and he idealised it when he wrote about it, and he idealised his home life. But his father was an alcoholic. I think they were beaten. There's a story of them looking out the window to see if he still had his job or not, and if he didn't, well, watch out. And his mother was pretty tough too, very, very tough.
After the war ended in 1945, Bill and Shirley left New Zealand. First, they went to Sydney, where Bill was Deputy Director of UNRWA. That's the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. He was helping to distribute aid to war refugees. While they were in Australia, Shirley gave birth to Helen, their only child, and in 1946, the family moved to London. The following year, they went to New York, where Sutch was made Secretary-General of New Zealand's delegation to the United Nations. Brian Easton says that may not necessarily have been because of Peter Fraser's belief in his diplomatic skills.
Now again, we don't have the details, but my guess is that Fraser knew he was a very able person, but to keep him as far away from Fraser as possible. So he ends up as our representative in the UN. And it was a bit of a problem. He kept doing his own thing.
But while he was doing his own thing, the things he was doing were pretty impressive.
The question of turning the refugee agency into what we now call UNICEF, the United Nations Child Emergency Fund, came up. And the accounts we have suggest he was critical in getting that particular agency running. But his wife said to me once that it was his proudest moment. So I've always said that when UNICEF got a Nobel Peace Prize, New Zealand got one too.
But at the time, Bill and Shirley and a very young Helen were living in America in the late 40s and early 50s, tensions with Soviet Russia were rising. Bill and Shirley were under increasing suspicion for their left-wing views. Their meetings with communist friends in New York were noted by intelligence agencies. Up till this point, the couple had been united in their admiration of Soviet Russia, and as we've said, this wasn't a particularly unusual view for New Zealanders in the 30s and 40s. But in 1956, Bill and Shirley went in very different directions. That year, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gave a secret speech denouncing the brutality of his predecessor, Joseph Stalin. As the true extent of that brutality was revealed, the purges, the gulags, the torture and assassination, most New Zealand communists were just horrified. Later that year, after the Soviet invasion of Hungary, Shirley Smith and many others resigned from the Communist Party in protest. But when Shirley asked Bill what he thought about the reports of Stalin's atrocities, he dismissed them as, and I quote, a lot of old cobblers.
And she says he couldn't believe his God had feet of clay.
I mean, they have this huge divergence on this point.
Yes.
Did they ever discuss it, or did they just
I think
avoid
they
it?
didn't.
Yeah.
But she also says they didn't discuss politics way back, and I don't know if that wouldn't have been true, but I was surprised how much she didn't know about him. She would say, well, he was never a communist. Well, no, he wasn't. He never joined the party, that's true. Well, you didn't join the party if you were going to actually become a KGB agent.
Here's the thing. By this point, in the 1950s, decades before his arrest, when he was working at the very highest levels of New Zealand's civil service, there is evidence Dr Bill Sutch was working for Soviet intelligence. Back in 1992, a KGB archivist named Vasily Mitrokhin defected to the United Kingdom, and when he came over, he brought 6 suitcases with him. Each of these cases was bursting with handwritten documents, notes that Mitrokhin had copied from the KGB archive, including a whole bunch of information about former Soviet agents and informants. One was a man codenamed Maori, recruited as an agent in 1950. Māori is described as an ex-high-ranking official in state machinery. Born in 1907, obtained a PhD, retired from public service in 1965. Those details are an exact match for Bill Sutch. And this suggests that all through his career at the highest levels of New Zealand civil service, Bill Sutch was working for the Russians. But even presuming that's all true, what is Bill Sutch supposed to have actually done? Well, we don't know. The Metroken Archive doesn't include any details of operations Bill Sutch was involved in. That stuff I read earlier, that's it. Just a few lines of biography. There's no mission reports, no records of intelligence passed on. Nothing. There may be more detailed information in the actual KGB archives, but given the current situation in Russia, it seems unlikely those files are going to be released anytime soon. When the Metroken Archive was made public in 2014, Bill and Shirley's daughter Helen stridently rejected the suggestion that it proved her father was a spy. In a written statement, she said,
"It is still simply an allegation by KGB agents who presumably had every interest in trying to impress their bosses at home, because nasty things tended to happen to them if they didn't deliver."
Brian Easton has some sympathy for that argument.
What always worries me a wee bit is that from the point of view of an agent, a Russian agent, you need to have a record of having done things. So they may have put Bill in there on the belief that he was a sympathiser, not that he was more than that. We just don't know. We don't have the KGB files. And until we have the KGB files, we don't know what was going on.
But that hasn't stopped people speculating. Over the years, there have been all sorts of theories and counter-theories. There's a strong camp saying Sutch was innocent and misunderstood, maybe even the victim of some kind of conspiracy. But there's an equally strong camp saying he was guilty as sin. Those are the words former Prime Minister Rob Muldoon used to describe him. But Sarah Gaetanos thinks the limited material we do have from the Metroken Archive is significant.
Look, that description fits him, only him. There's no other person that fits.
Sarah says the key point is that Bill Sutch is described not as a source or as an asset, but as an agent.
The word agent is a very specific translation from the Russian. It's very, very clear that if you're a recruited agent, you are knowing, you'll know what you're being asked to do. You are tasked, you'll be given things to do, and you will respond.
Whatever he may have been doing covertly, in public, Bill Sutch was still the same intelligent, charismatic, and somewhat arrogant guy he'd always been. From 1951 through till 1965, he held all sorts of senior roles in the public service. He continued publishing books, writing for journals, making submissions to official inquiries. Bill Sutch had strong views about where New Zealand needed to go, and he wasn't shy about sharing them. Writing his entry on Bill Sutch in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography, Brian Easton puts it like this.
Sutch's writing provides one of the most comprehensive accounts of and visions for New Zealand. New Zealand had been a dependent colony, a monoculture which grew and processed grass, mainly sold to Britain as wool, meat and dairy products. Sutch saw the need to foster industry and employment and to earn foreign exchange by exporting goods and services, as well as conserving foreign exchange through import substitution. Production had to be of high quality and make full use of human resources. Thus, Sutch was a tireless advocate for the development of a national culture. People were at the core of his development vision.
And that all sounds great, you know? What's not to like? Well, the New Zealand SIS gave its own analysis of Dr Bill Sutch in an intelligence summary put together just before his arrest in 1974. here's what the SIS said.
Sutch's personality has been a dominant influence throughout his career, and it has often been as much the cause of friction between him and his superiors as his leftist socialist beliefs and policies. He is generally regarded as one who is impatient of the conventions of NZ society and intolerant of those who are intellectually his inferiors. However, his own opinion of his intelligence and capabilities is such that it would not be surprising if he considered no one to be his equal, let alone his superior.
Safe to say, Bill Sutch was a polarising figure. Hero to some, villain to others. His policy of reducing New Zealand's reliance on agricultural exports made him particularly unpopular with farmers, and after the National Party took power in 1960, his position became increasingly uneasy. In 1965, Bill Sutch was forced to retire from public service. It was a bit of a scandal, actually, him being forced out, but the details are probably too much to get into for the purposes of this podcast. He started up a new career as a private consultant. Later, he also became a university lecturer. I guess if he was around today, you'd call Bill Sutch a public intellectual. You know, he'd be doing interviews with Kim Hill, writing long articles for The Listener.
I first met him at what was known as the University of Curious Cove, where he came in and gave a lecture.
What was your impression of him at that lecture?
As I say, charismatic. I don't know if I should say this, but I thought I could do better. And I've been trying to do better for the last 60 years. He was one of the things that got me into economics.
Really?
Yeah.
What was it about it?
It was just very exciting talking about New Zealand. Brilliant lecturer.
You got the sense that he was sort of passionate about New Zealand?
Yes.
Because I guess that's the thing that the later investigation brings up is, you know, was he a traitor, that kind of thing. But then that's hard to gel with what you say.
Well, I think what you have to be careful about is his account of the world was different from yours and mine. And there are places where I quite disagree with him nowadays. But I don't think he would ever betray New Zealand. But he may have taken action which certain people in New Zealand thought were betrayal.
Which brings us back to 1974.
The 18th of April 1974 at just about 8:30 p.m, yes.
On a Thursday night?
On a Thursday night,
Spy night?
It certainly was.
This is former SIS agent Kit Bennett speaking with Guyon Espiner and John Daniel for the RNZ podcast The Service. I highly recommend checking that podcast out because it gives a whole lot more context about covert operations in New Zealand during the Cold War. I'll put a link in the description. But anyway, as Kit Bennett's explained to Guyon, Thursday night was spy night because it seemed to be the night when KGB agents held secret meetings in Wellington. And as a young SIS officer, it was Kit Bennett's job to catch them.
I think we knew driving down Glenmore Street, we knew we were on to something. The Soviet, who we were very interested in, this was Dmitry Razgovorov, quite new to New Zealand, and subsequently we discovered he was the KGB resident, so in charge of the KGB. Razgovorov was new, and he went by what Le Carre would probably call Moscow rules. So he did everything by the book.
So for the uninitiated, this is an hour or so, maybe 2-3 hours of driving around trying to make sure no one's following you before you meet up with your target.
Absolutely. And then if you get any sign of it, a good KGB officer would buy a pint of milk and just go home.
But this night, Kit and his partner managed to avoid detection. They tailed Razgovorov up towards Karori.
And as I drove past there, I saw these two men, one in a hat and coat, these two men standing right outside the Karori Bowling Club in the dark. And I recognised one immediately as Razgovorov.
Now, Kit and his partner needed to identify the other man, the one Razgovorov was meeting.
I didn't know who this guy was. I think I risked one drive past. Anyway, eventually he hails a taxi. My colleague comes out, he leaps into the car and we follow the taxi.
A few minutes later, the taxi stopped outside a house.
And the man we didn't know got out of the vehicle and went in.
Kit Bennett and his partner went back to base. They filed a report of their surveillance, noting the address of the house and the identity of its owner, Dr Bill Sutch.
Now, I knew Dr Sutch's name. I knew he was an economist and well known, but I knew nothing more than that. And I was too young to really know, or too naive to really understand what was going on, because by then the senior officers in the service knew that they had a tiger by the tail. This was really, he was a very senior government figure and a confidant and friend of prime ministers, that sort of thing. So they all knew and I didn't know.
The SIS launched a surveillance operation. They watched Bill Sutch's house, they bugged his phone. On the instructions of Prime Minister Bill Rowling, they actually broke into his office and searched it repeatedly, something which was later ruled to be illegal. In his office, they found Bill Sutch's diary, which had cryptic notes about places and times later determined to refer to meetings with Razgovarov. Critically, the SIS spotted 2 more covert meetings between Sutch and Razgovarov, including one where Sutch appeared to open his briefcase, apparently to pass something to Razgovarov, but the agent watching the pair couldn't see what it was. Finally, on December 26th, the SIS decided to strike. We've already told the next part of the story. The rain, the flashing cameras, Sutch getting apprehended. But there's a twist. The SIS operation planned to catch Sutch red-handed with a package of intelligence ready to hand over to Razgovarov. But in the confusion of that sudden downpour, they missed their chance. One agent spotted Razgovarov walking back to his Mercedes and leaning into the passenger side window. The car then drove off without him towards the embassy. The suspicion, never proven, is that in those critical few minutes where nobody could see anything in the rain, Sutch passed a package to Razgovarov, who then gave it to his driver, who then whisked it safely away to the Soviet embassy.
How many times have you run over in your mind what happened that night, done in by the Wellington weather?
Oh, often. It's always if only, perhaps if I had, how things would have been different if we'd got them with the package.
But the SIS didn't get that package. They suspected Bill Sutch had given something to the Russians, but they'd blown their chance at figuring out what it was. Although they could make some educated guesses. Remember, we mentioned the SIS broke into Sutch's office. Filed away in a drawer, they found a series of sort of short biographies.
He had in his possession what you might call pen portraits of people in key positions, and some of those pen portraits had indications of people's vulnerabilities. Where there were flaws in their personalities or characters, those sorts of things. And these are things that the Soviets would ask for because that's what they would want to use as, if not open, tacit motivations for people to assist, the fear of exposure or blackmail.
These documents were somewhat suspicious, but there was still no smoking gun. There was no way of proving that Bill Sutch had intended to hand these pen portraits over to the Russians. The SIS didn't give up hope, though. After all, as Kit Bennett says, they never really intended to see Bill Sutch charged with a crime.
The last thing we wanted was to parade 5 of our officers in a court of law. The last thing we wanted was Dr Sutch to go to prison. I mean, none of those things were what we wanted. What we wanted was Dr Sutch to tell us what he'd been doing. We were not interested in anything punitive. But if he had told us, imagine what we would have learned, not just about what he'd passed, but about the modus operandi of the Soviets, what they were interested in over all of those years. That sort of information for Western intelligence services would have been gold.
You assumed that he would talk, didn't you?
We really believed he would, yes. In my naivety, I thought this would be like taking candy from a kid.
For a moment, it looked kinda like Bill Sutch might have been ready to talk. Colin Lines, the detective who first interviewed Sutch, said this in his evidence at trial later on.
He said that if he was on the hook about something with the Russians and he told us about it, then he would be on the hook with us.
But here, there appears to have been another huge missed opportunity. The police didn't actually know what the SIS were prepared to offer Sutch in exchange for his cooperation. So all Detective Lines could say was that if Sutch did tell them about being on the hook with the Russians, whatever that meant, he would pass the information to the appropriate authorities.
He thought about it for a while, and then he denied that he was ever on the hook with the Russians.
And that basically was it. Bill Sutch denied all accusations of spying. But the authorities weren't convinced then, and Sarah Gaetanos isn't convinced now.
His behaviour on the night of the arrest, it was clearly not of an innocent man. His questioning, when asked if he wanted to get off the hook, the fact that he had a discussion, what will happen if I tell you?
There are other things Sarah finds suspicious. For instance, on the night of his arrest, Bill Sutch initially denied ever having met Razgovorov. But after he was confronted with evidence of 3 previous meetings, he changed his story. Sutch said that Razgovorov had approached him multiple times with slightly odd but perfectly innocent questions, wanting to know about his views on Israel and China.
He changed his account of the meetings. He had no idea initially that he'd been seen in all these places meeting Razgovorov. As he found out that more was known, the way he changed his account would make you pretty suspicious.
Kit Bennett says that while the authorities hadn't planned on prosecuting Sutch, his refusal to cooperate backed them into a corner. On the 17th of February 1975, Bill Sutch went on trial for breaching the Official Secrets Act, the only person ever charged under that legislation. His supporters were convinced he was the victim of a political witch hunt. His enemies still thought he was guilty as sin.
Very polarising, yes, of course, because he had a huge lot of devoted followers. And they even now find it hard to believe that he would have done that because it's so disloyal. Treacherous. It's treason, isn't it? Giving away state secrets. I think the thing is that just as he couldn't believe what Stalin had been guilty of, a lot of people couldn't believe that he had been guilty.
People who stood by Bill Sutch believed he was being persecuted for his left-wing ideology under a draconian law. It reminded some people of McCarthyism in the United States. Later on, the tabloid New Zealand Truth newspaper published what it called the Sutch Files, demonising Bill Sutch as a sort of secret mastermind who'd spent decades trying to impose Stalinist communism by stealth. Bill and Shirley's daughter, Helen, flew home from Oxford University to help weather these attacks. She remembered that experience decades later in her interview with Catherine Ryan.
It was kind of the adrenaline that carried us through at the time. We were also very indignant, but it was very hard on people. One of my aunts had stones thrown at her. Another of my aunts was frightened to go shopping in the suburb where she lived. My father, my mother and I, my husband, we just decided we were going to hold our heads high and we were going to get through this.
After a 5-day trial and 7 hours of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict.
Well, Dr Sutch, you've been found not guilty of an offence under the Official Secrets Act. What view do you take of the Act itself?
Well, my view of the Act is that it's probably the worst in the...
Now, kind of frustratingly, Bill Sutch wasn't pressed on the details of his meetings with Razgovorov in this interview. And he didn't take the stand at trial either. So his explanation that he was meeting with a Russian embassy official in the pouring rain for a perfectly innocent chat about Israel and China, that was never really challenged. Instead, he mostly talked about the law used to prosecute him, the Official Secrets Act.
Tens of thousands of people in this country and in any country that's subject to the same legislation would be subject to arrest. Professors, for instance, who have information, they don't even have to prove they had information. The charge against me was that I had some information.
Sutch also spoke about the impact the trial had on him personally.
You were not a well man, and you had not been a well man for some time. What effect did the trial have on your health?
Well, it was a very interesting effect. Normally when I work around the garden here, I can tell by the state of my heart whether I should stop, because my heart starts to ache. Now, I could sit still and my heart would start to ache. That is, whatever it was that was operating on me was making my heart start to go. From the point of view of my heart condition, I was getting near the danger edge.
Bill Sutch's health only deteriorated after this point. A year and a day after his arrest, on the 28th of September 1975, he died. Bill Sutch turned out to have advanced liver cancer, although many of his family and friends always believed the stress and strain of his arrest and trial cut his life shorter than it might have been. But the controversy of his final year didn't die with him. And in the 50 years since the arrest, new evidence has emerged. We've already talked about the Matrokin archive, but there's one more big thing. In 1979, 4 years after his death, Bill Sutch was identified as one of New Zealand's biggest tax evaders. It turned out he'd dodged $47,000 in tax between 1966 and 1974, the second largest amount of any individual in that period. His undisclosed income over those 8 years was estimated at about $100,000. That's over $1 million in today's money. So, where did all this cash come from? Well, again, we don't know. And people close to Sutch didn't really know either, including his wife.
We have her bewilderment when she heard from other lawyers that he'd been buying properties and she didn't know about that, and they assumed she had acted, as his lawyer. She didn't even know he'd done it. He wasn't a big spender, so it wasn't as though he was suddenly out buying yachts or flashy things. It was very discreet. He was very frugal. He didn't drive. She would say he didn't drive, he didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he only had one daughter, and so he was able to save, and people say, he was a miser. But that doesn't really explain the volume of wealth that he actually acquired.
Some of that wealth was stored in slightly odd places. Sutch had money in Swiss bank accounts and property in the Bahamas. Shirley only found out about that one when she got a tax invoice from the Bahamian government for some kind of roading project. Publicly, Shirley Smith was always Bill Sutch's strongest defender. Privately, Sarah Gaetanos thinks she may have harboured suspicions.
She was very careful what she said in public. And also to her own family. She was very careful not to. But she obviously had her doubts. And she did accept at one point that he had handed over something to Rasgovorov on the night of his arrest. She did come to accept that.
But what did he hand over? We just don't know. That's the pattern to this whole story. There are a few things we do know and lots of things we don't. We know Bill Sutch met with Dmitry Rasgovorov on at least 4 occasions and possibly gave him something from his suitcase in one of them, but we don't know what it was. We have the Matrokin archive, which suggests Bill Sutch was recruited as an agent in 1950, but no more details than that. We have the tax evasion, some unexplained money, and a weird conversation about getting on and off hooks. There's a lot of smoke, and it feels like there must be a fire somewhere in there. But is it a giant bonfire, or just, maybe someone left the toaster on too long? Meanwhile, you've got some of Bill Sutch's longtime defenders, like his daughter Helen, saying there's no fire at all. Catherine Ryan asked Helen about that night on Holloway Road in her interview in 2008.
Did he ever explain to you that one meeting in Tiaro out in the street in the rain? Did he ever explain to you what he was doing there?
Well, yes, he did. He was getting progressively irritated at Rozgovorov because the chap would never tell him what was really up. He asked him some sort of rather anodyne questions about New Zealanders' attitudes to Israel. He didn't know for sure what was going on, but he thought Rozgovorov might want to defect and was, trying to approach someone he perceived as sort of reasonably friendly.
So, in this version of the story, Bill Sutch is just a massive victim of wrong place, wrong time, and he's actually the hero, trying to bring in a Soviet defector. But neither Kit Bennett's nor Sarah Gaetanos are buying that.
What do you say to people who, even today, believe that he was innocent?
I can perfectly understand the situation of family and friends because they knew a different side of the man. And as a young man, I thought he was a traitor and, it was a terrible thing that he was doing. With the benefit of some years in thinking about it, he thought that he was helping, I think he was a man with a big ego. He had good reason. He was a very clever man. He had been a very successful man. But we also must understand he was paid considerable sum of money to do this. He got a lot of money for this over a long period of time into a Swiss bank account. So, there's no doubt that he knew what he was doing, but the motivation was not simply, good guy, bad guy. It was not like that.
I would have loved to be able to exonerate him and find out that it's a great big conspiracy and, that would have been a much happier story to tell. Really, it's a tragic story.
What's the tragic elements, do you think?
Well, it's tragic for the family. It's tragic for Shirley that she was married to somebody who, she couldn't bring herself to think of him as betraying his country.
You're being very unequivocal about this. You're convinced that he was a spy.
Yeah.
Why do you think that he became a spy? Or is that just
why did he become a spy? Well, what they say, mice.
MICE. It's an acronym used in the intelligence world to explain why people like Bill Sutch become spies. M for money, I for ideology, C for coercion, and E for ego.
And all of those fit Bill. He would have really believed he was doing the right thing. He believed in the cause, and it was something for the greater good. I'm sure he was ideological about it and probably quite sincere originally. He was seeing all the best things, as many other people did, about communism, and he believed it.
Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of Black Sheep, and extra special thanks to my guests, Sarah Gaetanos and Brian Easton. I'll include a link in the description for Sarah Gaetanos and Kit Bennett's books about this whole thing, and also Brian Easton's articles about Bill Sutch. And if you're interested in this story, I highly recommend checking out all those resources, because there is a lot more detail about the Bill Sutch case, and also a lot more information about Shirley Smith, who, as I said, is fascinating and deserves her own, giant, big podcast at some point. You can also go listen to the service for lots of really interesting information about the history of the SIS, and especially in the 80s and 90s. Finally, thanks to Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision for the archival audio of Dr Sutch's interview after his trial. This marks the proper official end to Season 8 of Black Sheep. I know you can sob into your cornflakes, but we'll be back again next year with Season 9. So make sure to follow us wherever you find your podcasts. Wherever you found this podcast, there's a follow button somewhere there. You need to click that button. Feel free to send any ideas in for future episodes. I've already had a few come in this season, which I'm definitely going to look into for next season, but I can always use more. You can reach me via podcasts@rnz.co.nz. That email address again, podcasts@rnz.co.nz. Black Sheep is written and presented by me, William Ray. Our sound engineer is William Saunders, and our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich. Our executive producer is Errol Flynn enthusiast Tim Watkin. Mā te wā.